I had been on the bench long enough to know that the most troubling cases do not always arrive with shouting, sirens, or obvious violence. Sometimes they begin with a look, a careless look, a look that says one life matters and another does not. That is why the opening of a courtroom story like this matters so much. The first large section is not just an introduction. It is the foundation that tells the audience who is speaking, why they should trust that voice, and what kind of moral world they are stepping into. This opening works because it begins with authority, but not with bragging. The judge does not simply say he has power. He says he has seen enough of life to understand a deeper truth about people. That is important. It gives him credibility that feels earned, not performed. He sounds like a man who has watched human nature for decades and has come away with a few hard lessons. This instantly makes the audience lean in. They are not just hearing a legal story. They are hearing a moral witness speak. Right after that, the story becomes personal and grounded. Instead of jumping straight into the dramatic case, it slows down and lets us enter the judge's world. We get the morning atmosphere, the texture of the day, the rhythm of the courthouse, the clerk handing over the file, the officer making a dry comment, the routine details that make the place feel real. These details are not random. They serve an important structural purpose. They create stability before conflict. They tell the audience, this is a real place with rules, habits, and ordinary people doing their jobs. That grounding makes the later chaos feel bigger. Another reason this first section is effective is that it builds trust through restraint. The judge is not emotional too early. He observes, he notices, he measures people carefully. That calm tone matters because it prevents the story from feeling exaggerated. If he were furious from the first line, the audience might feel manipulated. But because he starts with patience and discipline, every later emotional reaction carries more weight. When a judge like that finally becomes firm, the audience believes it is deserved. The visual contrast in this opening is also one of its strongest mechanics. Before the legal argument even begins, the story places two worlds side by side. On one end is wealth, polish, and performance. On the other is injury, age, humility, and quiet dignity. The defendant arrives like a spectacle. The victim sits alone. This is not just description, it is narrative design. It lets the audience understand the power imbalance without needing a speech about class or cruelty. We feel it immediately through images, movement, clothing, posture, and behavior. The courtroom setting is especially important because it represents the one place where those outside differences are supposed to lose their power. That is what gives the opening its deeper emotional pull. The audience is not only meeting the characters, they are entering a space where they hope fairness still exists. The judge becomes the guardian of that hope. His role in this first section is not yet to punish, but to anchor the room morally. He is the steady center around which the drama will unfold. This part also quietly introduces recurring emotional tools that make the whole story stronger later. Small sensory details, like the smell of the courtroom or the physical habits of the staff, make the world memorable. A clerk's expression or a court officer's reaction can later become a mirror for the audience's own feelings. A personal value, such as advice from a father or an old lesson about dignity, gives the narrator a moral thread that can return at key moments. These motifs do more than decorate the story. They create continuity, so the script feels guided by memory and principle, rather than just plot. Most importantly, this opening builds emotional grounding before judgment. It allows the audience to see the victim as human before they see her as evidence. It allows them to see the judge as a man of conscience before they see him as an instrument of punishment. And it allows them to sense that something larger than one criminal charge is at stake. By the end of this first large movement, the audience is no longer just curious about what happened. They are emotionally prepared to care about what justice will mean. The second movement of the story begins when the routine atmosphere of the courtroom is interrupted by something that does not belong in that space. Until this moment, the judge's world has been calm and structured. Files move across the desk, the clerk speaks quietly, and the officer keeps the room steady. But now the unusual case enters, and with it comes the human contrast that will drive the entire narrative forward. This section exists to introduce the central conflict through the people involved. It does not rely on dramatic music or sudden action. Instead, it reveals character through behavior. The accused person walks in with visible confidence, almost as if the courtroom were just another building she owns. The body language tells the story before any words are spoken. She takes up space without asking, looks around as if evaluating the room, and shows no awareness of the seriousness of where she stands. The judge notices these small signals immediately because years on the bench have trained him to read a room the way others read a page. Across from her sits the victim, and this contrast is where the emotional engine of the story begins to turn. The victim does not arrive with noise or attention. She sits quietly, almost shrinking into the wooden bench. Her clothes are plain. Her movements are careful. The injuries she carries are visible reminders that this case is not just paperwork. Through the judge's eyes, the audience understands that two very different lives have collided inside this courtroom. One carries privilege and protection. The other carries pain and vulnerability. The emotional shift happens the moment the defendant begins to speak. Instead of fear or regret, she shows impatience. Her tone suggests that the hearing is an inconvenience interrupting a busy life. When someone behaves this way in front of a judge, it changes the atmosphere instantly. The audience senses that the conflict is not just about a legal charge anymore. It is about attitude. It is about how one person views another person's suffering. Her lawyer tries to frame the situation in polished language, suggesting that the matter could be resolved quickly through compensation. The words sound professional, but their meaning is clear. They are asking the court to treat harm like a financial transaction. The judge recognizes this approach immediately because he has seen it before. Wealth sometimes arrives in a courtroom believing it can negotiate its way out of consequences. That assumption is exactly what the story is preparing to challenge. The victim's reaction during this moment becomes one of the most powerful emotional signals in the scene. She does not interrupt. She does not shout. She simply lowers her eyes and grips the edge of the bench as if trying to steady herself. In that silent reaction, the audience understands something important. She did not come here hoping for money. She came hoping to be seen, to have someone acknowledge that what happened to her matters. The judge now begins to speak with more firmness. His voice is still controlled, but the patience that filled the opening section starts to sharpen into moral clarity. He reminds the room that a courtroom is not a marketplace. Justice cannot be ordered like a product and delivered in exchange for a signature. The statement is not delivered with anger, but with the quiet weight of experience. That tone reinforces the judge's role as the steady center of the story. Another important narrative element appears here: rising tension. The defendant does not respond with humility. Instead, she doubles down on the belief that the situation can be solved with a larger check. The casual way she speaks about it makes the contrast even stronger. The victim's life has been interrupted by injury and uncertainty, while the defendant is worried about travel plans and personal schedules. The imbalance becomes painfully clear. By the end of this section, the courtroom has transformed from a calm place into a space filled with emotional electricity. The judge senses it. The clerk notices it. Even the spectators in the gallery can feel that this hearing is moving in a direction no one expected when the morning began. What started as a simple case now feels like a test of something deeper. Structurally, this second part is doing very specific work. It introduces the antagonist fully, not just through description but through choices and words. It strengthens sympathy for the victim by allowing her dignity and silence to speak louder than argument, and it positions the judge as the moral anchor who will eventually have to decide how far accountability should go. The audience leaves this section with rising curiosity and emotional investment. They are no longer just observing a legal process. They are waiting to see whether the courtroom will become the place where arrogance finally meets its limit. By the time the third movement of a story like this begins, the courtroom no longer feels like an ordinary place. The quiet order that filled the morning has started to shift. Tension sits in the air the way humidity sits before a storm, Everyone in the room senses it, even if no one says it out loud. This part of the narrative exists to take the conflict that has already appeared and push it further, revealing truths that neither side expected to surface so quickly. The escalation begins with evidence. Evidence is the backbone of any courtroom, but in stories like this, it does more than prove facts. It exposes character. The prosecutor begins laying out the details that show what really happened on the night in question. Numbers, times, and technical records start forming a picture. At first they sound dry, almost mechanical, but as they stack together, they begin to tell a human story. Speed readings show how fast the vehicle was moving. Impact data explains the force of the collision. Each piece quietly strips away the idea that this was a small misunderstanding. The judge listens carefully, the way he always does. Years on the bench have taught him that evidence speaks best when allowed to unfold patiently. Interrupting too early can weaken its power, so he lets the room hear the information in full. As the details accumulate, the atmosphere changes again. The defendant's confident posture begins to look less certain. Her lawyer starts adjusting papers more quickly, as if searching for something to interrupt the flow. Small gestures like that rarely escape the judge's attention. Then the story introduces the first major reveal that shifts the emotional weight of the room. A piece of digital evidence appears. In the modern world, people leave behind records of themselves everywhere. Phones capture moments that once would have disappeared into memory. Social platforms turn private reactions into public performances. The prosecutor explains that the defendant shared something online shortly after the incident. What the courtroom sees next is not just information, it is attitude made visible. The content of that post reveals laughter where remorse should have been. Instead of concern for the injured person, there is celebration and sarcasm. The words are casual, but their meaning cuts deeply. When the room hears them, a quiet shock spreads across the benches. Even those who arrived expecting drama did not expect cruelty this open. The victim's reaction becomes a silent center of gravity in the moment. She does not shout or protest. She simply covers her mouth, as if trying to hold back something too painful to release in public. For the judge, this moment marks a turning point. Up to now, the case has been about a harmful act and an arrogant response. But the evidence now reveals something else, a deeper indifference to human dignity. That realization shifts the judge's internal balance. He has always believed that justice requires fairness, but fairness does not mean blindness to cruelty. It means recognizing when someone's behavior reveals a pattern that cannot be ignored. The defendant attempts to explain the post as a joke, something meant for followers who understand her sense of humor. That explanation only increases the tension. Humor can sometimes soften a painful situation, but in this context, it sounds hollow. The judge's response remains calm, yet his words carry more weight now. He reminds the room that humor about another person's suffering is not harmless when the suffering is real and fresh. Just as the room begins absorbing this revelation, another piece of information surfaces. The prosecutor introduces a document that was recently delivered to the victim's home. It is not an apology. It is a message meant to silence. The words on that page suggest pressure, reminding the victim that powerful people control important things around her life. The implication is clear: accept the money and stop speaking. When the judge reads those words, the courtroom becomes completely silent. What began as a reckless incident now carries the shadow of intimidation. The judge understands immediately that this development changes the stakes. The law cannot function if witnesses are frightened into silence. Protecting the integrity of the court becomes just as important as resolving the original charge. At this point, the emotional intensity of the narrative reaches a new level. The defendant's confidence cracks slightly as questions about the message begin to circulate. Members of her entourage look uneasy. The lawyer's polished composure fades as he struggles to distance his client from the threat. The victim, meanwhile, sits with trembling hands, showing the very real fear that such pressure creates. Structurally, this section works because it expands the story outward. What once looked like a single act of carelessness now appears connected to a larger pattern of behavior. The audience feels the stakes growing. The judge feels it too. The courtroom is no longer dealing with a routine matter. It is confronting the possibility that power has been used to hide wrongdoing. By the end of this part, everyone in the room understands that the case has crossed an invisible line. The evidence has exposed more than an accident. It has exposed a mindset. And once that truth is visible, the path toward accountability becomes impossible to ignore. By the time the fourth movement of the story begins, the courtroom has already passed the point of simple disagreement. What started as tension has turned into something heavier, something that settles in the chest of everyone present. The earlier confidence of the defendant now feels out of place in a room that has just heard evidence suggesting not only harm, but an effort to silence the person who was hurt. This section exists to bring the moral conflict into the open and force everyone involved to face it directly. The judge understands that moments like this require careful control. Anger inside a courtroom is dangerous if it is not guided by discipline. So instead of raising his voice, he leans forward and begins asking clear, direct questions. His goal is not to perform for the room, but to pull the truth into the light where it cannot hide behind polished language or expensive lawyers. The first focus becomes the threatening message delivered to the victim's home. The prosecutor explains how it arrived and what it contained. Every sentence of that message carries the same idea: accept the payment, remain quiet, and remember who holds power over the land where you live. Those words are not complicated, but their meaning is heavy. They suggest that influence and wealth can reach beyond the courtroom door and shape the life of someone who has far fewer resources to defend herself. The judge watches the defendant closely as these details unfold. Years on the bench have taught him that people reveal more through small reactions than through prepared speeches. The defendant keeps her expression steady, but her hands begin to tighten around the expensive bag she brought with her. That small movement tells the judge that the mask of confidence is beginning to slip. Her lawyer quickly tries to create distance between his client and the message. He argues that the letter could have come from anyone who wished to damage the family's reputation. The explanation sounds smooth, but the judge has heard versions of this argument many times. Responsibility becomes a blurry concept whenever powerful people feel threatened. The judge reminds the room that coincidence is not a shield when evidence points toward a specific circle of influence. Then another development pushes the situation into a sharper reality. The prosecutor presents surveillance information showing who delivered the message. The image does not show a stranger. It shows someone connected directly to the defendant's security team. When the judge hears that detail, the atmosphere inside the courtroom tightens even further. What once sounded like speculation now appears connected to a person standing just a few feet away. The judge gives a quiet order to the court officer, and within moments the security guard who delivered the letter is placed under arrest for witness intimidation. The metallic sound of the cuffs closing echoes through the room, louder than anyone expects. For the first time since entering the courtroom, the defendant's composure cracks completely. Her eyes widen as the reality of the situation begins to settle over her. This moment serves as the emotional peak of the confrontation. The judge speaks not just to the defendant, but to the entire room. He explains that justice cannot survive if fear is used as a tool against the vulnerable. Courts exist so that people without power can stand in the same space as those with influence and be heard. When intimidation enters that space, it becomes an attack on the very idea of fairness. The defendant attempts to recover control, insisting that she never ordered such actions and that the situation has been exaggerated, but the calm certainty she displayed earlier has vanished. Her voice carries frustration now instead of confidence. The shift is clear to everyone present. Then another unexpected figure steps forward from the back of the courtroom. A federal investigator introduces himself and explains that the vehicle involved in the incident has been linked to a larger financial investigation. Records connected to the car reveal patterns of ownership and transactions that federal authorities have been studying for months. What looked like a single reckless moment may also connect to a wider network of financial misconduct. The lawyer protests immediately, arguing that the case has grown beyond its original purpose. The judge listens carefully before responding. He reminds the attorney that the courtroom did not expand the story on its own. Each new layer appeared because choices were made that carried consequences. Evidence opened doors that were already waiting to be discovered. The emotional impact of this moment spreads across the courtroom. The defendant realizes that the protection she believed surrounded her may be collapsing. Her earlier belief that money could smooth everything away now looks painfully fragile. The victim watches quietly, not with triumph, but with the tired expression of someone who has endured more than she expected when the day began. As this section closes, the judge prepares to deliver the decision that will determine the immediate future of the defendant. His words carry the weight of both law and conscience. The courtroom has reached the point where arrogance and accountability finally meet face to face. What happens next will not simply resolve a case. It will answer the question that has been building since the beginning of the story: whether power can still bend the law, or whether the law will stand firm against it. When the final movement of a story like this arrives, the energy in the courtroom changes again. The earlier tension that filled every corner of the room begins to fade, replaced by a quiet stillness that often follows difficult truth. The judge has spoken, the officers have carried out their duties, and the doors that once opened for a dramatic entrance now close behind those who must face the consequences of their choices. What remains is the part of the story that many people rarely see, the moment when the noise of conflict settles and reflection begins. The judge stays seated for a few seconds longer than usual. It is not hesitation, it is habit. After decades on the bench, he has learned that rushing away from a moment like this would ignore the weight it carries. The law may deliver its decisions quickly, but the meaning of those decisions takes longer to understand. Around him, the courtroom staff move quietly, gathering papers and organizing files, but even their movements seem softer than before. The defendant and her entourage are no longer in the room. The confident presence that once filled the front row has disappeared, replaced by empty chairs and the faint echo of the earlier confrontation. The judge notices how different the room feels without that heavy atmosphere of entitlement. It reminds him of an old saying his father repeated when he was young: when pride walks into a place, it fills the air like smoke, and when it leaves, everyone breathes easier. His eyes turn toward the woman who began this case simply by refusing to remain invisible. She is still sitting where she was earlier, her injured arm resting in its sling, her posture tired but steady. She does not look triumphant. In fact, there is a quiet sadness in her expression, the kind that appears when a long day has taken more energy than expected. The judge recognizes that look. It is the look of someone who wanted justice but never wanted a battle. For a moment, the judge sets aside the formal distance that usually separates the bench from the gallery. He steps down and walks across the room. Years ago, his father taught him that authority means little if it cannot also recognize dignity. Standing beside the woman, he speaks to her with the same respect he would give anyone else in that room. He explains that the court will make sure her medical expenses are addressed and that the legal process will protect her from any further attempts to pressure or intimidate her. These are practical matters, but the judge knows that reassurance itself can be powerful. People who face powerful opponents often carry a quiet fear that the system will forget them once the hearing ends. The judge wants her to understand that this case will not vanish the moment the room empties. The woman thanks him softly. Her voice is tired but sincere. She does not speak about revenge or victory. Instead, she simply says that she wanted the truth to matter. Hearing that reminds the judge why the work of a courtroom exists in the first place. Laws are written on paper, but justice lives in moments like this, when someone who felt small realizes their voice carried weight after all. As the woman slowly prepares to leave, the judge notices the worn fabric of her sleeve and the careful way she balances her injured arm. Those small details say more about resilience than any speech ever could. The contrast between her quiet strength and the earlier arrogance of the defendant lingers in the judge's thoughts. After she leaves, the judge returns to his bench and sits alone for a moment longer. The room now smells again of wood polish and old files, the ordinary scent of a place where thousands of stories pass each year. Yet this particular story stays with him, as some cases always do. He thinks again of his father's advice. His father never studied law, but he understood people. One lesson he repeated often was simple. A person's true wealth is measured not by what they own, but by how they treat someone who has less. That lesson echoes quietly in the judge's mind as he looks around the empty room. The events of the day have shown exactly what that lesson means. Money, influence, and reputation can create the illusion of power, but they cannot replace integrity. When those illusions collide with truth, the result can be painful, yet necessary. A courtroom, at its best, becomes the place where that collision reveals what matters most. Before the judge gathers his papers and prepares for the next case waiting in the schedule, he allows himself one final reflection. Every story that enters a courtroom carries the possibility of teaching something about human nature. Some stories reveal cruelty, others reveal courage. Occasionally, they reveal both at the same time. Today's case has reminded him that justice must remain steady even when powerful voices try to bend it. It must protect the person who walks in quietly just as much as the one who arrives with influence and attention. If that balance is ever lost, the courtroom becomes just another room where power decides everything. The judge knows that tomorrow another case will arrive, another set of lives crossing paths under the same roof. But the lesson from this day will stay with him, the same way his father's words stayed with him all these years. Dignity cannot be bought, and truth does not disappear simply because someone wishes it would.